Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to June on the Range 2025. This is Michael K. Vaughan event, of course, where we are reading westerns, western novels, western short stories, some western nonfiction in the course of the month of June to celebrate a genre that once upon a time was very much a king of the range and is no longer. Barely any typical westerns published anymore, at least in the mainstream publications. A trickle. Whereas once upon a time, they were everywhere. And they made money, so every author in the world who could bang out a book on a Remington typewriter in 30 minutes was lining up at publishers' doors to make sure that their books were in consideration. Which is why if you've got a pretty good used bookstore, I've got a pretty good used bookstore, you can find millions of these old paperbacks, just millions of them. And I did. I found a bunch of those and was stockpiling them for June on the Range. And the one I read last night was actually two. It was an Ace double. For years and years, Ace, the publisher, used to do doubles, where you would get a paperback detective story, or especially a science fiction story, or a western, and you would read it. It would have a cover, and then you would flip it over, and the back of the book would be a separate cover to a separate book, and you would be reading that book as well. It's still the same number of pages. It's not some sort of Star Trek mystery. It's not a TARDIS. It's still the same number of pages, and they're never very long. This is not a very long thing. So I just read a whole Ace double last night. I added it to my pile, which is kind of fun in its own right. There is a kind of 8-year-old thrill to flipping the book and starting a different novel. That was kind of thrilling. So I read the first one first. This is by William Colt MacDonald. Now, I am assuming, as I do in all cases with June on the Range, that is a pen name, and that it's a pen name for someone who wrote 100 books. At least 100 books. This was Boomtown Buccaneers. And you see, right, it's an ace, so you flip this over when you're done. And this is the story, basically. I mean, there's a lot that goes on in this story, but basically it revolves around a murder. As a number of westerns I've been reading recently have done. It not only revolves around a murder, but it revolves around trying to figure out who the killer is. A murder mystery, in other words, just mapped onto this thing, as I guess was common at the time. This came out in the 1940 or 1941, and I guess that was common at the time. It certainly was common at the time in science fiction, that you would just take a western plotline and map it onto science fiction, put it on an alien planet, have ray guns instead of Colt 45s, and, Bob's your uncle. But in this story, there is a comely young woman, but there is a nice guy, surprisingly wealthy, nice guy, thousands of dollars on the line, named Jabez Drake. And he ends up dead. And he ends up dead on the watch of the town marshal, whose name is Peaceful Jenkins. And he is by far the most interesting thing in this story. By far. He has an assistant named Applejack. And there is a bad guy named... what's his name? Hugo. Hugo Randall is the bad guy in the book. More or less. I mean, the 1940s, early 1950s were really the heyday of a lot of Western authors liking to indulge in that pattern that I mentioned, where the bad guy isn't completely bad, where he's strong anyway, and that maybe some element of that strength appeals to the good guy. Now, Peaceful Jenkins is completely good. And he's also completely peaceful. He just wants the law to run his town. But he is more than capable of cracking heads if he needs to. At one point, he faces off in the book against two burly bouncers at a bar, and slaps them around like they were little children. And one character says later on, well, they're bruised, but they're up on their feet again, and they look like they're spoiling for a fight, but they're not going to spoil for a fight with you again. It turns out they do, but they don't get any better at beating Peaceful Jenkins. Peaceful Jenkins was my favorite character in here. I really wish that I could read more of his adventures. But he has a deputy named Vaughn, who ends up being trouble, as the Vaughns always do. And I liked it. I liked the story. I thought that this is a clear example, and some of you will know novels like this, where one of the characters is just so much better than all the rest of the story. The whole thing is top-heavy. What's a good example of that? An example that we would all know. Well, for instance, Catcher in the Rye. Holden Caulfield totally dominates that book. Not in the sense of him being the strongest character in the book, but it's totally lopsided. It's Holden Caulfield, and then in small print at the bottom, Catcher in the Rye. There's nothing to the book but him. And that was largely true here. Peaceful Jenkins is in almost every scene. Almost every part of the novel revolves around him, luckily. Because there really isn't a whole lot to read otherwise in Boomtown Buccaneers. And what's his name again? William Colt MacDonald has a real drive for describing scenery. His characters, for instance, are forever describing where they are instead of what they're doing or what they're thinking. And he describes a lot of it too. I won't say that ever made the book boring, but you've got characters talking in sure enough, darn tootin', cliche cowboy ways that they feel like a suit that MacDonald is putting on, rather than a lot of that palaver, the lingo, the owl hoots, the ranny hands and whatnot. It doesn't feel genuine at all in a large part of the book. Peaceful Jenkins always feels genuine, but then he I noticed rather tellingly, almost never has any of that jargon associated with him, and almost never speaks it himself. It's almost like, what's his name again? William Colt MacDonald maybe knew on some level that he had a genuine character here and didn't want to dress him up in the typical stuff of the dime store Western novel. So it wasn't successful. Not completely. There's a big finale. Jabez Drake does get justice, and you're rooting for Peaceful Jenkins the whole time. But there were stretches of it where my attention was wandering, and that's bad. If you're only writing a 150-page book, my attention should never wander. And then when I was done with Boomtown Buccaneers, I flipped the book to Crossfire Trail by Louis L'Amour, which turned out to be a read for me. I've already read this Louis L'Amour at least twice. I was happy to read it again. And it is very much an example of what I'm talking about from Boomtown Buccaneers, in that it is entirely dominated by one character. Rafe Karadec is the main character of this book. But unlike Boomtown Buccaneers, the book is designed for that to be true. You are supposed to never take your attention away from Rafe Karadec, and you don't. He's on board a ship. A shipmate of his is beaten almost senseless, and turns out fatally, by the brutal master of the ship. And before that shipmate dies, he tells Rafe Karadec his story, that he has paid the mortgage on his ranch in Wyoming, and that he has signed over the deed of the place to his daughter and to Rafe himself, if he will ride to Montana and save the ranch. Not only through business acumen and through the ability to drive cattle and understand horses and whatnot and manage men, but also from any of the nefarious forces all around it. And it's Louis L'Amour, so there are 2 or 3 of those nefarious forces all around it when he finally gets there. And you think right at the beginning of the story that the daughter, who is now part leasee of the ranch, is going to end up being Rafe's sweetheart. And maybe she does. The whole point of reading a Louis L'Amour novel is that even though a lot of what he does is predictable, you don't mind at all. You don't mind at all. and I didn't. I don't mean any disrespect to William Colt MacDonald, whatever his real name is. I don't mean any disrespect to him whatsoever. This book, I think Crossfire Trail was written 10 years after Boomtown Buccaneers, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. Louis L'Amour is just better at doing this. That's all there is to it. I won't even say that there was less place description in here. I'm not sure there was. There could have been just as much. There might even be more, but it all felt real. It felt more natural. None of these characters, they all talk like the characters in MacDonald's book, but none of them sound like they're getting ready for, Randolph Scott to say it in the silence. Or that none of them sound like that at all. It all felt completely natural. And Louis L'Amour has a way Those of you who've never read him, those of you who've read him, I'm sure you'll agree with me. He has a way of getting to a scene and then charging through it. He charges through his scene right to the next one, and then right through that to the next one. It's almost impossible to think of a dull patch in a Louis L'Amour novel, not because he doesn't have he sometimes doesn't pick dull characters to center on, or maybe there's a subplot he likes but that he really should have cut. Not because of that, but because of the way he writes. You don't ever feel the slightest inclination to stop reading. Never. I don't know quite what that is. Obviously, it doesn't have anything to do with the actual plot or the depth of the characters or even the frequency of action scenes. It obviously, counterintuitively, doesn't have anything to do with that. Because it works. If you've got that magic, you can do it with all of those things failing you. Those things usually don't fail Louis L'Amour, and they don't here. Rafe Kardec, I think, I wouldn't be mean to Louis L'Amour to say he doesn't really have a personality. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. He is a bolt of lightning of pure right. He is pure right in a land of impure right and wrong. And that's all you care about. That's all that ends up mattering. You know he's going to win in a Louis L'Amour novel. Maybe that's true in a MacDonald novel too. I just don't know him well enough. But in a Louis L'Amour novel, you know who's going to win in the end. Sometimes, for instance, Lauren Esselman, definitely Elmore Leonard, can make you wonder whether or not good is going to win in the end and whether or not good is all that worth winning. But not Louis L'Amour. And yet, when I describe that, and I describe it that way, if you've never read Louis L'Amour, that's going to sound very simplistic, very boy's own adventure. And it isn't. It isn't that at all. And this wasn't even a voyage of discovery for me. I've already read this book. So now that is my entry for June on the Range. And now my main question here is Crossfire Trail going to make me read more Louis L'Amour tonight? I'm supposed to be reading, you're supposed to read at least one Louis L'Amour for June on the Range. Am I going to do that tonight? There's a good chance of it. There's a lot of Louis L'Amour that I either... Actually, I'm not 100% sure that there's a lot of Louis L'Amour that I haven't read. It's been a whole reading lifetime. He's been there the whole time. But there's a lot of it that I haven't reread. And certainly there's a lot I haven't read for June on the Range with close attention. So, could be. Could very well be. Of course, I might go in the opposite direction for tonight. I might read another Ace Double. That was a lot of fun. And this thing held up really well. So, I might read it. I have a few more of those for Western. So, I might do that. But either way, I'm not going to call the MacDonald book, Boomtown Buccaneers, I'm not going to call that a failure at all, mainly thanks to Peaceful Jenkins. I'm not going to count it as a failure at all. And Crossfire Trail was great, even though I think this is the third time I've read it. So my June on the Range is still going just fine, which is fine by me, because this only comes once a year. So I'll wrap this up, and I will reapprise you a little bit further on down the trail. Thank you, BookTube.